But the irony of Calvinism is the worldview of Calvinism doesn't begin with Calvin. It actually goes back a little further than that, right?
Yeah, one could say a lot further than Calvin himself.
So Calvin was born around the Reformation. He was one of the main reformers next to Luther.
John Calvin, 1509.
Yeah.
Died in 1564. So, yeah, he was a 16th century Reformed thinker, theologian, pastor.
And he fleshed out this system of providence of the elect, that certain people before the foundation of the world were selected by God to be with God as the elected. And then those who are not elected are the reprobate, and they will be spending time in eternity away from God in hell.
That's generally
the idea.
Yeah, there's more to it, but it definitely predated him, this idea, way before him.
And who is the originator of the Calvinistic world view? I mean, I guess the main framer of it. I'm sure it existed before what you're about to say.
The idea that God determines man's decisions, all actions, behaviors, that actually goes, you could find that even in Judaism.
Right.
You find that in Enochic literature, but you also have that in the three sects in first century Judaism, in first century Palestine, in the Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Essenes, where the Essenes and the Pharisees believed in divine determination, right? Where the Sadducees didn't believe in God's providence in that way, but it was again, the two that did agree disputed on foreknowledge or complete decree, where it was completely solely on God. And then later on in the life of the church, one could argue maybe St. Paul espoused on those ideas.
Right.
Depends on how you interpret him. But then in the church, the patristic age, you have the anti-Nicene, you have Origen, who talks about foreknowledge, God determining, God's choosing some people based on foreknowledge, right? Knowing in advance that you would choose the gospel, Christ. And so through your decision making, God knowing all things would save those who would respond with a yes to Jesus. But then you have Augustine. Augustine changes. He
began with the foreknowledge belief.
He had a foreknowledge belief. His teacher, St. Ambrose, had that belief, so he inherited that belief as a student of St. Ambrose. But then after 396, namely with his argument with Pelagius, with that whole Pelagian controversy, seems like, based on his writings, that it would be prideful that we would believe that we're making that decision of choosing God. It's actually God choosing us. It's human pride at the root of it, where it is God actually choosing us. So Augustine, there's an evolution in Augustine himself, but he lays basically the foundation of this predestination belief that then lasts throughout the next 1,500 years till today. But one last thing with Augustine is that somewhat scholars argue that he held on to double predestination, that not only did he save some, the elect, but he also before the foundations of the earth, decreed the reprobate judgment, eternal judgment. So there's double predestination, not just saving some, but also judging some, condemning some. And that's in the mind and will of God.
So what was it like growing up in the church in America? Was it different than Iran?
Ooh, all the good questions. Yes. Oof, so much. Okay. Just caveat, I was a kid there, so I didn't know about like the church politics or anything like that. So it was very ideal for me,
right?
In my memory, right? I don't know if I'm gonna press some buttons here, but I think one of the main things that I one of the main differences here that I noticed was role of women in ministry. I would say here I saw, especially amongst like conservative evangelical groups, Armenian churches as well, women preaching absolute no. And to me, that was surprising.
Because in Iran, the place where head coverings...
which is known to be oppressive towards women, that we had women preaching and teaching, and the word of God is the word of God.
So in the church setting there, women had more freedoms, but societally less so. But here, societally, a lot of freedoms, but within our context.
Circles, yeah. I will say our ordained pastors in the Armenian church were still males.
Right.
But in terms of, preaching in general, that's one thing. Other things, again, I grew up in a very small evangelical Armenian church, organ, hymns from the El Majan. And then here the church I went to, which was great. I loved the freedom there. But at first it was surprising to me. There's like drums and lights and like all these like microphones, sound system, everything. Everyone's clapping and raising their hands. I didn't grow up in a charismatic church. So to me, all of that was a culture shock.
Okay.
Over the years, there's been, it's hard to theologically compare the two, I would say, because again, I was a kid back then, so I wasn't engaging in theological conversations.
Okay.
But in terms of first reactions, I remember those
two things: the music, the wow, that's a lot of fascinating insights, and I think you would assume the opposite culturally, but then that's the beauty and the craziness of culture, and then the subculture within cultures that you can't assume things all the time,
right?
And each church experience will be different for different people.
Oh, absolutely. And even Iran, I'm sure, let's say
there's different there's different types of denominations and theologies with different expressions. So if you date with the intentionality of calling it a date, but not like doing it secretly or doing it worldly, then it could help cultivate. All right, we went on a few dates, but that's it.
Exactly.
Don't make a big deal out of it. We weren't in a relationship. They were just dates.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's dating with intention without the pressure of like courting for marriage and without the worldly aspect of like, oh, dating means we're hooking up.
Yeah. And the church culture itself needs to be like, all right, that's cute. They went on a few dates. Let's not plan their wedding and make a big ordeal about it. Let them figure out if they're compatible or not. And I think that space needs to be created, because it'll either be secretive and weird because they won't have that process of knowing if it's a good fit, self-discovery, or they'll do it in a way that they're going to just react to the church culture and just become the opposite and kind of let go of the Christian principles. What are some other trends you see that are maybe like not healthy for the dating scene in the Christian culture?
Yeah, I think that one is a huge one, probably one of the biggest ones. The other piece I would say is similar to what you said, but I think coming more from like a male perspective is like not being really clear and like forward with their intentions. And I think what you just described kind of plays into that a little bit, because they're so afraid of like doing the wrong thing. So then it creates a lot of confusion and mixed messages. Like, we've had so many women come to the program that, want to date. And then when we kind of dig deeper, oh, well, there is this guy at church. I've liked him for 10 years. And he's, I don't know that he's dated somebody. In the meantime, he's probably dating a lot of people in the background. But they kind of think that that's like normal because no one's actually like explicitly expressing.
So what are your thoughts on if a girl likes a guy at church, is it okay for her to ask the guy out?
Yeah. So what I would say is what you would want to do is just like express, but not expect. So when we talk a little bit more about like leaning into like, the feminine, it's not like, hey, having that define the relationship, like, hey, what are we? Or like, hey, like, let's go out on a date. It's more like, hey, like, I really enjoy our time together and hanging out, and just like letting that be there. And then if they want to pursue you from that point, like you've kind of, quote
Just
unquote, dropped the hanky and they can pick it up and
so drop
take it from
more
there.
obvious hints if they're not getting the message. But
Yeah.
yeah. And then, let's talk about it. Let's open the can of worms, because I think this is where the Christian church gets like poo-pooed upon with the gender roles and the headship of the house and of the male and the submissiveness of the
Yeah.
wife. What is your aspect? What are your thoughts on just gender roles and then comparing in the church and in general?
Yeah. So I think what, the big thing that I really see, especially from working primarily with women, is that and I work with like really successful, driven women, that their like ambition and I'll say like more masculine, quote unquote, qualities are really like that's where they get their success from in the world, in corporate, wherever they work. And then the big struggle that they have is like, okay, I'm like this at work. I'm, going after it. I'm climbing the ladder. I'm being more active and proactive. And then when it comes to like dating and relationships, they're kind of getting a different message there, and they don't know how to translate that. Like, how am I want this thing. I have this goal. I want to be married, whatever. And I don't really know how to go into that. But what I always kind of help people and empower them to do is like lean into that, like, if you're a woman, like lean into that femininity with the acknowledgement that like you have both parts in you. Like, and you talk about this with God, like all the time. He has aspects and personality traits that we would ascribe to like one gender or another. But especially when you're dating, I think you really have to kind of go about it in a way like the famous passage says. It's like, okay, husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church, and then the wife's submission comes as a result of that. So if you're a woman dating, you have to say, okay, is this someone that I can see loving me in that way and leading the family in that way?
Yeah.
So looking for those characteristics ahead of time instead of picking someone that doesn't have that leadership and doesn't have that, okay, we can kind of come together and make this like a good relationship. Then you're trying to force them to lead when you already naturally like want to run the show. That's not a good dynamic that works. So what I say is try to find someone that already embodies a healthy way of being in that way. And then you're going to naturally want to kind of have them lead the relationship more.
Yeah. And I think I remember like 20 years ago when I was an undergrad, I took a sociology class on the family, and the professor just dissected the Ephesians 5 passage, and it was kind of like just attacking it nonstop. And I remember I also sensed a lot of hurt, and found out later there was a lot of hurt behind that, because you usually get to that phase when there's a lot of abuse of those passages, because it says submit to one another, wives submit to your husbands. So the idea of submission is Christ-like, because Christ submitted perfectly to the Father. And then the husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So you also have to be Christ-like, and the willingness to die for your spouse. That's what leadership means. I'm gonna take the bullet. So both are Christian expressions of Christ, and Paul says this is actually a mystery of the gospel. It proclaims what Jesus has done for his bride, the church, which is us. So it's interesting how much abuse could happen, but when it's done well, it's quite a beautiful thing. And I remember I preached on this actually a couple of weeks ago, because we were going through Ephesians. Someone came up new to the church. I'm like, great, new person from Europe comes up to me and goes, I don't like this concept of men being the head of the house. And then I just use the analogy of a dance. It's kind of like a dance. Most cultures, the man is leading but nudging, but they're usually one unit. The two are one. It's a beautiful dance. It just nudges, but they're in sync to the same rhythm. They're relying on the same sort of style or beliefs, and then they're doing this wonderful thing where they're dancing.
Yeah.
And then I asked her, how did you meet your spouse? And she goes, salsa dancing. I'm like, perfect. It worked. So, and this is coming from a lot of the people, immigrants coming from Europe. They didn't want state religions, primarily the Church of England. They're coming to America. You have different parts of the country, like the Pilgrims with a certain congregational Calvinism. You have the Quakers and in Pennsylvania sort of things. You have different pockets of the colonies wanting to escape sort of these persecutions, whether it's like the Huguenots in New York with the Amsterdam. They're coming from a place where they're feeling this resistance. Is that correct?
Yeah.
There's a history, a narrative to trace this thing
Yeah.
from it.
Okay. Well, we can go back.
They're reacting towards something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Heike, we can go back further than the Constitution, and it's a really interesting point that you make. So the United States was founded in many respects, by people who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe. And they came to the United States to be able to worship God as their consciences directed them. Now, it's not quite fair to say they were opposed to all established churches, because the Puritans in Massachusetts did establish their church.
Yeah.
And as I said, that lasted until the 1830s. And as I'm sure you know, there were differences among these groups. I mean, the Congregationalists saw things differently from the Baptists, who saw things differently from the Methodists. And there were differences. But what's really interesting is, what historians will tell you is, one reason that the First Amendment grew up in the United States, that we have a First Amendment in the United States, was the social reality of the founding of the United States. Because there were so many different religious groups. Now, to be sure, they were mostly under the umbrella of Protestantism, but there were so many different religious groups that none of them, even if they wanted to, none of them really could impose itself on everybody else. And so religious pluralism is in a way, is the social fact that leads to the legal construct of free exercise of religion. And it's also very interesting in American history how you have these two streams. There is the Enlightenment stream, which is, very skeptical of religion, very into rationality, and, the deists like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and so on. On the other hand, you also have the evangelical Christian stream, people like Patrick Henry or Sam Adams or John Jay, others. And both of these groups supported religious freedom for different reasons. The Enlightenment types like Jefferson, they were skeptical of religion generally. They didn't like the idea. They thought that we have to protect the state from the corruption of religion, from the religious fanatics who would take it over. And the other side, the evangelical Christians, and this goes back even to Roger Williams, they thought we have to separate church and state in order to protect the church. They weren't concerned about the state being corrupted. They were concerned about the church being corrupted. But both of these two groups, both of these streams merge together and give us the American ideal of no establishment of religion and free exercise of religion.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I oftentimes hear that there's this debate: was America founded on Christian principles? Was it a Christian nation? And it's kind of a both and. Yes, there's some factors of that, but there's also this secular side also being some of the founding fathers. And like you just said it so eloquently, they had a common interest in having these clauses implemented for different reasons.
For totally different reasons. I mean, as I say, people like John Jay or Witherspoon or some of these founders, they were very serious Christians, and they weren't concerned about that Christians were going to contaminate the state. They were concerned that the state was going to contaminate religion, right? And on the other hand, you had other people who thought, we've had hundreds of years of religious wars in Europe. We don't want them here. And we want to keep kind of religious enthusiasm, religious extremism out of our government. And they kind of both work together. And, for much of our history, we have avoided, I think, serious religious conflicts for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the First Amendment. The other is the fact of pluralism, and also the fact that people could move. So like Roger Williams, when the Puritans got irritated with Roger Williams, he moved to Rhode Island. When the Mormons started up in upstate New York and they ran into trouble with the authorities, they moved across the country all the way to Utah. So we don't necessarily have that escape valve anymore for this.
Right.
So we have maybe some more problems now. Also, all of these groups were really, as I said before, they were within the great umbrella of Protestantism. And so even though they thought of themselves as different, I explained to my students in my law and religion seminar yesterday, in the 18th century, a Presbyterian marrying an Episcopalian would have been thought of as a mixed marriage, right? Like, what is this nice Presbyterian boy doing marrying this Episcopalian girl? But Tocqueville says this in Democracy in America. They were all Protestant Christians. And that also, I think, tended to tamp down conflict. But now we don't have that anymore.
Now I want to unpack your expertise on taming our time and how to overcome procrastination. So I'm someone who wrestles with that concept of procrastination. What do you say is procrastination to begin with?
I like one psychologist describes it as everybody's amiable psychopathology. And another guy, Dennis Waitley, says, losers tension relieve, winners goal achieve.
Okay.
So for whatever reason, when we're faced with big tasks or urgent tasks or important tasks, people find ways to escape from doing the work into tension relief. And so that to me is the best description, best definition of procrastination I've yet come across.
Tension relief. Procrastination means tension relief.
Well, escaping the task at hand in order to relieve tension.
And do you feel with technology and the ability to just take your phone, scroll on social media, this escapism is just next level a little bit, or it's kind of
absolutely, it's off the it's off the charts. So I recently did a time management seminar, and I talked about the fact that just recently my Facebook page has changed dramatically. I used to, when I'd click on Facebook, it would open up to my timeline. But now it opens up to a page called Reels, Reels, which I think is Facebook's answer to TikTok. It's a continuous series of short videos. It seems to go on ad infinitum. And they have figured out from videos I have clicked on in the past what topics are particularly of interest to me. Like I get lots of videos about animal rescues. I get lots of videos about surfing. So the first time it popped up and there was an animal rescue video prominently displayed, I thought, oh, well, I can take 5 minutes and just check this out. So what happened to this critter? The next thing I knew, 30 minutes had gone by. Just like that. So it was all tension relief. It was fun. But I wasn't accomplishing anything at all.
Wow. Wow. So what's underneath this concept of tension relief? Like what's really behind procrastination? Why do people do it?
Well, there's if you study the subject, there are a number of reasons, but the top three that I saw in my coaching practice were, first of all, people would be overwhelmed by a task. It was just too big for them. They didn't know how to get started. They didn't know where to start. So that's a very practical reason. But
so they get like paralyzed, like flight or freeze. They're like frozen.
Well, they didn't know what to do first, how to start, and so they just did something else. That was
watching surfing videos on Facebook. Okay, right. got it. Okay,
yeah. And then the second biggest reason I saw, along with people feeling overwhelmed, was simple impulsivity. That's where the tension relief thing really comes into focus. That I come up to a point where I can push myself into the work, or I can take a step in a different direction and do something that tension relieves. So if I'm not aware of my impulses, I will tend to drift off into whatever. I go play fantasy football, or I just I check out Facebook posts or whatever it is, whatever I find to be relaxing. So people getting in touch with their impulsivity and not having it control them, turning that around is another strategy we have to talk about. And then the third thing I saw most commonly was perfectionism. That when people are faced with some kind of task that they must do or is simply important to them.
Yeah.
That if they've had that upbringing where they had helicopter parents, let's say, people were always trying to control them. They either come up with a sense of fear that I'm going to fail at this task, or a sense of resentment that even though this is something they ultimately want to do, they're dealing with an old wound and it's still influencing their behavior. And so it brings up all this angst around simply doing something that's important.
Right.
So to relieve the angst, they go off impulsively into some kind of tension relief. So it's kind of the human condition as I see it.
Amazing. So the way to overcome procrastination is to kind of figure out what is the root cause of it for you first.
Well, I think that might take therapeutic work.
Okay.
I think I would refer that to someone who was more skilled at getting inside your head and heart, into your psyche, and figuring out what your history was like and why you do what you do. But I think if you employ certain strategies, time management strategies, that regardless of what is driving your impulsivity or driving your desire to procrastinate, you can get on top of them.
Okay.
Paul said to the Ephesians, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. So in the Greek term there, agorazo, means literally to take back or to buy out from under. So we think of Jesus redeeming the human race and the incredible price he had to pay in order to do that. So redemption carries with it the idea of redeeming the time means we're going to have to do some kind of work, put in some kind of effort, conscious effort, to take it back from what Paul calls its evil tendencies. And I would certainly identify wasting time, frittering away time, procrastinating as one of those tendencies.
Could you give a brief history of the Syrian civil war? Because I feel like we forgot with the chain of events of news that this isn't, but it's also hard to understand. So what exactly led to a civil war?
Let me first say that Aleppo, as an Armenian community, it's a center of Armenian community in whole Syria. I mean, Aleppo is the main community,
the main hub
for Armenians. Several schools, several churches, Apostolic, Protestant, Catholic. If I'm recalling right, probably 11, 12 denominations.
Of Armenian?
No.
Oh, just
Christian denominations. Yeah. So it's Christian-based, Armenian-based community.
Yeah.
In Aleppo. Of course.
And I think this is important for our listeners because they may hear the word Syria or a Muslim country and they can't wrap their minds around that there's these institutional, cultural, Christian presence. That's it's Bible-based, beautiful Christianity.
You're totally right, because I do remember now when I was traveling at one of the airports before coming to the US, the officer was asking me, "What do you work?" I said, "I'm a pastor of a church."
Yeah.
Because I was presenting the Syrian passport.
Right.
So he says, "How come there is a church in Syria?"
Right.
How come there is a church? As if the Christianity started from.
It started from the Mayflower.
Yes.
That's where Christianity starts. Yeah.
That's the birthplace of the Christianity.
Right. It's amazing. I mean, the Antioch Church is what you're describing.
And of course, the majority of the population are Muslims.
Over time.
Yes, but
historically.
But you have quite a good number of Christians, Armenians, and not only that. And I will give you another example, that next to the Emmanuel Church that I served, and we were living there.
Yeah.
The parsonage was next to the church. Next to the church is the mosque.
Yeah.
And it was the nearest church mosque in Syria. Just only a space of a car between the church and the mosque. And people are living
friendly.
There is nothing there. And when the war started, Then the fanaticism destroyed the country, unfortunately.
Wow.
So I used to say golden age and stone age. So before the war, Syria was in a golden age.
Wow.
And after the war and after, stone age, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what was it like leading the flock during the Stone Age, I guess? Because you're trying to keep it together while
I stayed in the church.
Yeah.
I stayed in the church, and every single Sunday, we used to have worship service, not asking anyone to come or not to come. It's a personal decision. As a family, Alina, George, and Vas, four of us, and even during the war, the first 2 years especially, they were there. So every Sunday we were there at church. Although bombing here and there, snipers here and there, and people were attending the church faithfully every single Sunday. And now I'm remembering 82 years old lady. Saturday evening, a lot of bombings. We were not able to sleep at the parsonage. We were in the basement where the whole of the church there, and used to sleep in the corridor of the apartments just to be, kind of hiding ourselves from the bullets, from the bombings, this and that. And that Sunday morning, I was telling myself, I don't know if people will come. Shall we do a church service or not? I'm just within myself, I'm talking like this.
Yeah.
Of course, my family is there. And God taught me a lesson. And the lesson was the church, when we started the church, probably a handful of people, and then almost 60, 70 people attended the church. And I realized this lady,
82-year-old lady.
the 82 years old lady, after finishing the service, I went directly to her. So as a pastor, usually people will expect from the pastor, where are you? Where have you been? Why are you not coming to church? The first question that I asked her, I said, why you came? My concern, if something happened, I feel guilty, kind of.
Right.
She says, Pastor, it's amazing. She says, it's better to die in the church or on the way to the church instead of sitting at home dying there.
So you grew up in the same area as I did, but we even though grew up in the same area, we probably had different life experiences a bit, right?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah. So tell me about your upbringing, man. What was that like?
Well, I moved from the Bronx in 1997 to Spring Valley, New York, which is a suburb about 35 minutes right outside of Manhattan, New York City area. I really felt like I was moving to Alaska. It just
Yeah,
a 30-minute drive, but I remember when I first started driving and I drove from Spring Valley to the Bronx, and I was like, whoa, that was like super fast. Probably got there in like 20 minutes. So anyway, but it was a world away, honestly. And grew up in a Jamaican household. Both my parents are from Jamaica. My mom was born and raised in Jamaica. She was born in England, raised in Jamaica. And my father's of a Rastafarian background, grew up with that kind of heritage and culture, music, marijuana smoke and all. And that was what I was around growing up. And then when we moved, I basically, Spring Valley is a super diverse town. I remember I was sandwiched in between two Filipino families. I had white friends, Indian friends, here you are, Armenian.
Yeah.
I had people from all over the world, played soccer. That's where Haig and I met. We played on the same soccer team. You played Chestnut Ridge, right?
Yeah.
middle school, high school. I did quit after a little bit, but and just had that diverse background culture, and started attending church, like a church in the area called Faith Assembly of God, which is not too far from where I lived. Around that same year, 1997, 98, and really just began my journey of learning more about Jesus at that time. But grew up partially with my parents, partially single parent household. Got 2 siblings, and they actually both live in LA right
Oh
now.
wow.
So, yeah, it's
Well,
crazy. So I was just out there, and I wish I would have known. I would have linked up with you, but I was just out there
it's still a
early
fresh
this year.
move, man. Yeah.
Yeah, fresh move, cool. Yeah, so I mean, I'll be out there more for sure. Yeah, so that's pretty much the gist of the overall of a little bit about my background. Traditional immigrant household, very education based, very much not into the creative arts, not necessarily seeing an avenue in the lane for
Yeah.
even ministry. Just, hey, we came to this country, we want you to have a stable lifestyle, we want you to do well, we want you to be able to afford your life and your children, and we came to this country so that you would have a better life. So very similar background in that regard. You were born here, right?
Yeah, I was born here, but immigrant parents. And I think
Right.
what you just
First
captured is
generation.
there's that common thread that like we introduce our parents to the country. We start working when we're 5 years old. there's
Yeah.
clearly this hustle of being an
Yep.
immigrant kid. But I think it's quite amazing that upbringing we had with that diversity,
Mhm.
because I realize how unique it is after you're away from it, and then you hear these conversations about it. When you're living in it, it's just quite fascinating to just
100%.
learn it from each culture. That's the best way to learn, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, it's what shapes my heart for ministry, that I really got a heart for the nations. I didn't really put 2 and 2 together until I moved into maybe some more white spaces, or more predominantly black spaces, or even spaces that were, getting to Nyack, and realize, okay, Nyack was a very diverse campus, very diverse theologically, denominationally, and it just felt like, okay, this is more normal to me, and I didn't understand that ecclesiastically, like, this is the heart of God. This is what the mystery of the gospel is that the gospel was open to the Gentiles, and that in Revelation, the picture of what John saw, which is very interesting, as we've gone through so much this cultural tension over the last 3 years in our nation, or at least we've been awakened to the cultural tension that's always been there. You see John making it a point to say, and I saw every tribe, every tongue, every nation. Like, wow, that's a thing, in glory. So my heart is for the nations. Oh wait, your church is called Church for the Nations?
Yeah. That's
insane, bro.
yeah.
So I love that. Yeah, so that's my heart, and I just want to see the kingdom come, and that all people from all backgrounds, all cultures will be welcome.
And celebrated. I think that's the beautiful thing about this. Like, I've been to Jamaica. I actually served as in an orphanage in Christiana, right in the middle. It was my first flight.
Oh, Kingston. You went to Kingston, or
Christiana, right in the middle of the country.
In the center, yeah, that's country.
But yeah, I mean, just like we celebrate cultures, the foods, the beef patties, the ting, the jerk chicken, like
jerk
good
chicken,
stuff, man.
And jerk chicken and beef patty and them thing. Yeah.
It's just fascinating, like, to just celebrate that, and that's the image of Christ. And I think if we don't have that heart, it could just be any social club, any movement. But what makes the Christian movement so special, like from the beginning of Acts 2, it's this multi-ethnic, lingual event happening where the Holy Spirit's the one bringing people together. And I think it can only be a work of the Spirit.
100%.
Otherwise, it just becomes just a community group.
And the cool thing about when you're united in Christ, and you're united in Christ from various backgrounds, whether that be generationally, socioeconomically, or ethnically, culturally. Like you said, how is it that people of different financial backgrounds, speak different languages, come from different cultures, and are of multiple different age groups, can all love one another and respect one another? Only the Holy Spirit can do that.
Absolutely. And that's the promise and the heart for the nations with Christ fulfilling the promises of the Old Testament. It's always the promises are for the nations in the Old Testament. I'm choosing you, Abraham, to create a nation to bless the nations, a kingdom that will have no end, David. So
Great.
I was trying to figure out why people aren't reading the Bible. And then I was trying to figure out why Christians aren't reading the Bible. And then I was trying to figure out why people aren't reading. And it's just this digital age that we're in. Both of us are millennials, and we were like a guinea pig generation because we're the first generation to grow up with digital technologies. We're digital natives. It was 1985 where more movies were checked out of the library than books. And we are more and more in a culture where we're reading less but consuming more and more snippets. And how we kind of digest our information also affects how we think, how we worship. There's this big correlation with how we consume media affects how we communicate, and literally our brains are shaped by it.
Yeah. And then as a pastor, I mean, we were in Manhattan for how many, 10 years? What would you say one of the biggest challenges for you was? Because, I mean, when you first started, that wasn't the case, right? You weren't preaching to millennials.
Right. I was mostly revitalizing an elderly church where a lot of the generational divides are even bigger because of him. Because if you're so I was a mainline Protestant church is what I took over. The church is 128 years now. And a lot of the Protestant traditions stem from the printing press. Martin Luther became Martin Luther. He became the first media figure because of the technology of the printing press. Before that, the church was more about just going to church, seeing icons and pictures and just knowing stories, more narrative. But when people had access to books, literacy went up. One of the big legacies of the Protestant Reformation is the fact that people got literate and were able to have the Bible in their hands. And the translation that Luther worked on and his writings became mainstream because of the technology of the printing press. So I say all that because the tradition I inherited as a congregational church and many of these struggling mainline Protestant churches, their customs, their traditions stem from 500 years ago, where everything was shaped around the technology, the printing press. And what do I mean by this? Look, you have hymnals, it's a book. You have bulletins, it's a piece of paper. The Bible, it's tangibly in their hands. Everything that was created was shaped with sheet music, with reading the Bible for themselves, the study, and it's all possible because of the mainstreamness of print. Now we live in an era where we don't like to have anything on piece of paper. We don't even like to carry cash, for crying out loud. Everything is digital. So what does that do to church? What does that do to the way we worship God and express it? So literally the churches that are thriving or growing tend to be the ones that are newer, that were planted more with the digital space. They were the ones using the TVs, the cameras, the mics beforehand. And they're the ones who tend to kind of succeed because they planted themselves with the digital technologies of even microphones. We take that for granted. Before then, one of the reasons why a lot of mainline old school preaching sermons where you had this orator who would enunciate words and kind of like preach the word and pronounce words, like we don't need to do any of that right now. I have a microphone.
Yeah.
It's a kind of becomes theatrics at that point. But back then it was important to enunciate and speak and kind of have pauses to project. So all these things are things that we don't really understand, but they do shape not only how we think, how we receive data, but also how we worship God.